So when you're designing your first project with Visual Studio, first piece is to figure out what you're kind of looking to do. We've talked through how to do the SharePoint apps and how to do the SharePoint workflows. So I'm going to kind of say all of that we covered in those sections of the course apply here. When you're doing workflows, worry about workflows. When you're worried about doing apps, we've got all those things we've already covered there. So let's talk just a little about the solutions and web parts here as we work through basically the tool that can do those. When you're doing those solutions, when you're doing those visual web parts inside of SharePoint 2013, know that you can take advantage of the server object model. You're not required to, and as a matter of fact, some best practices are if you don't need that capability to make a sandbox solution, which does use the client model that we talked about with those other pieces. But by running your code on the server, you do have the option of using that server object model, which means that you have some additional capabilities. You've got some situations where if you need to do administrative tasks, now the server object model allows you to do that, whereas the client object model does not. Being able to do some of the changes in the templates and be able to changes in those prohibited data items on the client object model, server object model lets you do that and lets you do that in your solutions and web parts. That being said, security not only still applies, but is even more important with server object model. Things have gotten a lot better since SharePoint development started back in the old days, but still be aware that you may have an object that you can see, that you can instantiate, and don't have permissions to look at any of the items inside of it. I can't stress this enough with SharePoint. Both test for permissions on any SharePoint object that you're looking at, and be prepared to capture exceptions, security exceptions. When you're going through there, things may even change after you do your checks. All the things that you need to worry about when you're worried about making things thread safe, consider that with SharePoint, because SharePoint is very multi-threaded. You're not guaranteed that everything stays the same through calls. So be aware of that, be able to do checks and tests and making sure that your calls are handled correctly and that you can degrade if all of a sudden the user that you're doing has permissions at one point and then loses permissions on items or lists or all types of things. There's a lot of concern with SharePoint development, especially the server model, about making sure that you're not touching things that you don't have permission to. SharePoint enforces those. There's a lot more capabilities of being wrong. One of the pieces that generally causes people a lot of grief is when you have SharePoint pages with items in it, but those pages may have public views and private views. Not knowing which one is which, or not checking to see if it's a private view, then you're pretty sure the user has access all the time. If it's a public view, then things may be managed outside of their context and changes happen dynamically. So as you go through it, keep track of ownership, where ownership can change, what's happening with that, and make sure that your application supports it. Again, we mentioned earlier about the when to do SharePoint apps and when to do SharePoint solutions. Guidance with SharePoint development at this point is with SharePoint solutions to not focus on visual aspects, to basically handle things such as what happens when a list is instantiated, maybe when an event is brought in on those lists, when an administration tool can activate or deactivate different functionality inside your SharePoint environment. All of those kind of pieces. If it's something that the users are going to be working with, again, you've still got the option for visual web parts, and those are still capabilities that you have in your toolbox. But first, discount using a SharePoint app in Visual Studio in SharePoint 2013, because as things move forward, there's going to be more and more stringent lockdowns on the code level, on the server side code. And if you're making those steps now, as you go into lifecycle management later on, you're going to be in a much better place. You're going to have to spend much less time on code maintenance. So building your first project. When we get into the demo, I'll walk you through creating a number of different types of projects. but Visual Studio has built-in templates for your solutions, your web parts, workflows, and apps. As you saw in the screenshot, that you've got all of those built in. As Visual Studio gets updated, those templates, if they're needed to, tend to be updated as well. They may be a little bit out of sync, but almost always within a month or so of a new important SharePoint release, maybe a service pack or an R2, you'll have the Visual Studio tools updated as well and keep those in sync. Visual Studio 2012 Tool Packs updates the templates for SharePoint 2013. So if you're still on 2012, you do need to put that extra template pack in there, but that tool pack does bring you up to speed, give you those same templates that you're looking at with Visual Studio 2013. So be aware of that. You're not left behind. It's just that you don't pick up some of the tighter integration that happens with every generation. And build tightly bounded functionality. This is one of those pieces where when you're looking at a SharePoint solution or a SharePoint web part or whatever, I've mentioned this in the workflow, but also I can't stress it enough, make very minimal functionality. One of the pieces that always gets people in trouble is with SharePoint is trying to make one end-all be-all solution inside of SharePoint. The problem with that is it tends to become complex. It tends to become hard to maintain the performance on, and it tends to be, just to be honest, all over the place. Making things very tightly bounded functionality and then tie those back into data stores inside of SharePoint itself makes a lot of sense. Being able to come in and say, maybe you have a support ticketing system that you're building into SharePoint. If you're not using the built-in functionality, maybe there's something that you need extra. Use the existing functionality inside of SharePoint. Being able to use the workflow that's already in SharePoint. If you need something additional, such as maybe bringing in information on a item update, or one of the examples we've had is a new project happens and pull in from external systems to maybe do staffing to do permissions, or pulling out of SharePoint into other systems for maybe hour reporting or logistics or those kind of things. Just put in the pieces that you need and tie in that functionality. Maybe it's a list event handler that when something changes, it goes out and reports to the external system, or a site event handler. When a new site is created, go off, pick up the metadata that's being passed in and work with that. But to be as tightly focused as possible. Maybe you're going to do you still have some web parts that you're working with maintaining, and you're looking at putting in something else. Instead of having one web part that does everything, have web parts that do just specific views or specific functionalities, and then have those tied together through that repository, that list or lists in the back end. That functionality comes in, does what it needs to, drops the data into the proper list, and then maybe something else. Maybe there's a different analysis view that operates differently from the entry view. And you can actually have those working together to provide most of the functionality rather than try and put it all in one and figure out who's the user and what mode and dynamically put the user experience in place. Having different user experiences for different web parts, and being able to even do things like targeting the web parts to different security groups becomes a lot simpler, a lot easier to maintain going forward. So consider that as we're going through there. As we look at each of the projects, I'll probably give you some more details on that, but you'll see how all of this fits in. And then packaging your app. You can deploy to a WSP or directly to SharePoint. With Visual Studio, you can push it up into your testing environment. You can actually push it up into maybe your dev environment where you're going through and you're doing debugging. I actually recommend that you do both of these, that you do the direct deploys for your development process and maybe even for your testing, so you can go in and do your builds. But when you're deploying into operations, put it in that Windows SharePoint package, the WSP file, because that way you can actually drop it in. As I mentioned, with all the other capabilities, having your ops guys be able to roll it in and out atomically, to be able to know that everything's packaged up, to be able to take those and put it on backups, or actually be able to do the package itself as it was compiled in a lifecycle management tool set, becomes very, very important for them. That reproducibility is hugely important for your operations guys. That's what their jobs are, is to make sure that everything is consistent, everything's reliable, everything has is responsive, and having all of those packages together really makes it a big deal. And then the packages themselves can be deployed and upgraded through PowerShell. If your ops guys aren't using PowerShell these days, absolutely check in with them. The SharePoint administrative tools are still around. You can still find them if you dig deep enough, but definitely you're strongly encouraged to go to PowerShell, and using those Windows SharePoint packages is going to make it very easy for them to go in, to maintain, to update, to roll out on a time basis. So a lot of automation, a lot of scripting, a lot of ability to put all of that in the right place. So now that's enough talking. Let's go in and do a quick SharePoint demo. Now, to begin using Visual Studio for SharePoint development, you'll need a development environment. Let's walk through the steps in setting up a development environment for SharePoint 2013 in a Hyper-V environment. Right here I have my Hyper-V manager, and I'm going to go through and create a new virtual machine for my SharePoint. You can see right here we actually walk through a wizard, so we're going to actually go through and do all the settings that we need for our machine. One thing to note is this is actually working on a Windows 8 Pro laptop, so it's something that even if you don't have a server installed, you're good to go with. If you've got something earlier, say Windows 7 or something like that, you can do this in a number of other areas. Virtual PC, if you've got other virtualization technologies, this all should work fairly similarly, but let's go through some of the settings and some of the steps you'll need to make sure that you've got it all working right. So we'll start up with our new virtual machine, which is our SharePoint dev environment. And I'm going to leave everything the same on storage. It's just going to put it into the documents. For Hyper-V, I am choosing Generation 1. You can choose Generation 2 if you're just using it for yourself, but Generation 1 is a little bit more compatible. You can move it around in various locations. You don't really need the new capabilities of Generation 2. If you do find it, you can move over to Generation 2, but I tend to leave it with Gen 1 just to be, again, more compatible. This laptop actually has 16 gig of RAM. I'm going to save some for operating system, and I'm going to be fairly slim on RAM. I'm going to give it 10 gig of RAM. If you're actually working with a lot of features, if you're really going to kind of go flat out with SharePoint, I would recommend at least 24 gig of RAM. Yeah, that does add a lot onto the machines, but if you got a machine that's a proper dev machine, you should be able to boost that up to at least 32 gig of RAM and have some left over for the operating system. Again, I'm showing you here that you can get away with about 10 gig. We'll be working with it. Things will run a little bit slower than you normally would expect for a dev machine. Just be aware of that as you're going forward. Configuring network, I am going to be configured to the network. Hyper-V has a standard wireless virtual switch, so we're going to go and use that. And it's going to let it create the virtual hard drive. I do let it go ahead and fully populate it. If you're thinking about doing a dynamic, it's best to go ahead and fully populate that hard drive. If it's dynamically increasing the size of the hard drive, it can slow things down, and that's one of the biggest challenges with virtual machines. So let's go ahead and do that. I am going to install it from a bootable ISO image, and let me go in and choose my server. So now I've got that in place. Note I am using an ISO from MSDN, which is basically for doing development. If you don't have a MSDN account, I have those links in the PowerPoint that can take you to the evaluation versions, which are really nice and really useful for this kind of work as well. There's links for both the Windows Server eval and for the SharePoint Server eval, so you'll be able to go through and put that in place. The only thing you lose from that, and I'll mention it again when we get to the SharePoint, is that you only license the SharePoint Server to the highest level, whereas if you're using your MSDN, you have a couple of different options on there. So we've got that in place. We've got our new virtual machine, and we're going to finish. It's going to go in and put our different information there. And before you get started on it, let's go in and check the settings. And let me make sure I can get this onto the, well, it's going to go off a little bit on the screen. But one thing that you do need to look at with Hyper-V is that SharePoint likes at least dual processors. So go in, change that number of virtual processors to 2. That's going to help you with the setup. So something I forget every once in a while when I'm setting it up, but it'll let you know when we install SharePoint. But for right now, that's the only thing you need to change after you go through the wizard. And let's power up. Let's connect to the environment. Let me get it right back down here so you can see it again. And let's power it up. Once we start this up, you need to again make sure that it's correctly positioned. And now the operating system will go through a couple of reboots, a couple of setups. You need to give it a little bit of information as you go through. You'll install now, and because this is it'll actually ask if you want to upgrade or if you want to do a custom install. You'll need to do a custom install, and we'll get into that in just a second. I'm going to pause for just a moment as I enter in my key. I hope you understand, and then we'll go on to the rest of the install. And here we are. I do like to install with the GUI just because, well, it's kind of useful for me. If this was a server that you're setting up that was going to be remote or was going to be something for production, you generally want to just set it as core and manage it through PowerShell, but I am not as proficient with PowerShell as some of the ops guys, and I'm actually going to be running Visual Studio on the desktop, so that means I do need to put the GUI in there. So just go ahead and we'll do that install. Accept the license. And here's where we do a custom, and you see it's unallocated, and away we go. So now we're going to let it sit here and run. We'll do some cuts so you don't have to sit here and watch everything copy, but then we'll roll through and have our Windows Server install done. And here we are to the final configuration piece. So let me go ahead and enter in a password. And we'll get all the settings finalized up. One thing to note when you're logging in Hyper-V, a Control-Alt-Delete is actually a Control-Alt-End. I always have to remember that one. And we'll let everything get started here. Let our server manager pop up, and there's one thing I tend to do before we get over to anything else. Now, as this is coming up, I will note that I'm going to skip over one of the steps that we normally would do, which is to create a group of accounts for doing testing. As you're doing development, I know it's not best practices, but often as a developer, you'll go through and you'll use administrative access. This is because of some of the different ways the development storage works and different pieces. But you do need to make sure you've got a number of different lower level accounts. So as you're going into SharePoint, you can actually test what's happening when you are touching those accounts that have less access, that may not have access to things or may have read-only access. I'm not going to set up those accounts here. Basically go into the create some local accounts, or if you're, since we're going to be working standalone here with SharePoint, that being said, if you wanted to, or if you can attach to an Active Directory somewhere, that makes it even easier to do. Those accounts generally are already set up, and you can share them across dev accounts. So anyway, just be aware of that on your development cycle. Know that you're generally going to be developing as an admin, but you want to make sure that you can go in and test and make sure that you've gotten the right permissions and you're handling permissions correctly as you go forward with your code. We'll take just a moment here. And one thing I like to do, because this is a dev box, go in and turn off the enhanced security. This isn't a production box. We are going to be doing dev where we don't want to be told that lots of code is coming down, especially unsigned code, since we're probably going to be generating that code. So just turn that off and you'll be a lot happier as you go forward. So now we have our server set up for our dev box, and let's go forward to putting together our SharePoint environment on it. So now that we have our server set up, let's get SharePoint on it. This is part of our process. So what we're going to do is come in, and on the media, DVD media, I'm going to add my SharePoint server ISO. And it's going to pop up and say, what do you want to do? We'll go ahead and run the splash. Just you don't have to do this, but it's going to help you kind of walk through what's going with SharePoint. So it makes it pretty easy to get SharePoint on the server. So it comes through, review the hardware and software requirements. We kind of know what we're doing there. Installation guide, all this read. Definitely recommend that you go through it so you understand more in depth. But we're going to skip right down to the install, the prerequisites. One thing to note is that my virtual machine is connected to the network. If yours is not, you can actually use the prerequisite tool to actually come in and see what you need to get installed onto SharePoint. You can actually walk through here, make your list, pull them down in the installation packages, and then move them over here like you have your ISO and install them yourself. I prefer to let it install for me. Makes things a lot easier, especially if I can do that network connection. And we're going to go through, accept the terms, and let the prerequisite tool run through. As with the install on the server itself, this is going to take a little bit of time. It's going to go through, it's going to configure, it's going to download the packages, it's going to install, and there's going to be a couple of reboots. So I'm going to let this run. We'll do some cuts to make it look nice, but know that this does take a while to do the preparation tool. And once we get finished with this, then we can actually go through and start installing our SharePoint. So I'm going to let this run for a bit, and we'll be back. Here we have a server restart. Just go through, let it restart, and it'll pull down more information. Now we have all of our prerequisites installed. You can see we can actually go down and see no action taken on several items, what's going on. You may review what's going on, but we'll finish up. Now that we have our prerequisites done, let's go forward and install the actual SharePoint. We'll go to the D drive and do an autoplay, just like we started. And you'll see we have our installer come up again. And this time, we're ready to install the SharePoint server. So let's get that going. We'll do the installation, and then we'll go through and do a quick configuration, so I'll have the basic piece. Again, I'm using my MSDN account, so one moment while I enter in the key. And now we're ready to do the install. Note that I did use the enterprise key, so what you're seeing here is the exactly what you would have for the evaluation license. So we'll go forward. We'll do a standalone install. This basically makes sure that everything is on the same server and is generally what you want to do for your development environment. There are a couple of things as we go through I'll make note of. If you're doing a standalone on a single server, there's a couple of errors you'll run into. We'll probably see those as we go through, and I'll give you some details. But for right now, let's get the install started. And now we have SharePoint installed. When I close this, we're going to run the configuration wizard and get everything set up. And here we go with configuration wizard. It's going to go through and do some setups and configurations. We'll let it do that. And as usual, this will take just a bit. So we'll let it run, and as items come up, I'll comment on it. And here we have the error I was mentioning. So what we're doing, what happens here is that what we've got is a issue with the accounts. So one moment, and we'll do a finish here. And let me get a command line. And if you'll note here where we go to, so now we're in our area here. So what we're going to do is create the configuration database manually, and this will let us go forward. Make sure I type it correctly. And note that we'll see some information about that distributed cache host again. That's simply because SharePoint's doing a lot of work to make sure a farm is capable, and since we're not running a farm, we're running a single server. There's some things that happen there. So now that we've got that going, let's go back and do our SharePoint configuration and let it finish up. So now we've got our second error. This actually happens because of some permissions on the analytics folder. So let's go in and take a look at that. And you look that we have analytics with basically a GUID at the end. What we're going to do is go in and share that. And once more run our configuration. And we have a successful configuration. As you can see, there are quite a number of steps to get SharePoint installed in standalone mode for your demo environment or your development environment. So just be aware, take a look at those steps that we did to get everything installed and successfully configured. And now we'll move on to get your Visual Studio installed and have it all working together. So let's move forward. And here, as you finish the configuration wizard, come up into Central Administration and just confirm that everything's good for SharePoint. And have it remember my credentials. You can choose to use recommended settings or not. And you can see our SharePoint is up and running. So we're ready to go from here. Let's go ahead and minimize this and step forward into getting Visual Studio running.